Thank you so much for joining us for today's panel. My name is Sarah Bartlett. I'm the museum curator for Yolo County. We are sort of doing this artist panel as a way for more artists to get to talk about their process as a part of the Give Face exhibition that Bz and I worked on here at the Gibson House in Woodland. So I'm going to let the artists do most of the talking here. So we'll go down the line. They'll each have a little presentation about their work, and then at the end we'll have time for questions. So if you're joining virtually, you can put your questions in the chat. If you're in person in Woodland here, you all have note cards that you can write your questions on, and we'll filter them that way. So I'll turn it over to Bz, and I will be here if you guys need me.
Thank you, everyone. All right. Let me get set up here. And I believe that's sharing. Yep. Okay. Great. So hi, everyone. Thank you so much to everyone who's here in the community in DC and Woodland and calling in from everywhere. Austin, I saw. And to my fellow artists and folks at the Yolo County Historical Collection, Yolo Arts 1882 Foundation, for bringing us together. I'm so excited and truly very humbled to be sharing the time and space together. So, my name is Bz Zhang. I'm an interdisciplinary artist and architect. And in my work, I look at how sites of our migrations and diasporas have been constructed literally and figuratively, how our communities and our stories get lost and also sometimes get found in the archives, and how we might draw forth futures of our communities, whether Chinatowns or beyond, through looking at their past and present. And as an artist, I use both documentation, so what we know happened, and speculation, or what we imagine might have happened, especially when the archives fail to bridge the expanses of time and space. And I'm doing this work in and from the vantage point of Tavanger, or what is currently called Los Angeles, the ancestral, present, and ongoing homelands of Tongva, Tataviam, and Chumash peoples. And I'm coming from a Chinese diaspora in a North American and US context. So, trained in Western art and architecture with family on both sides of the Pacific and with ancestral villages in Shandong and Anhui. So I'll start with a couple of phrases that might be familiar to us in some of these rooms. 丢脸 or losing face, and 保全面子 or saving face. And in her book, Ornamentalism, Anne Anlin Chang offers a feminist theory for the so-called yellow woman, whose peculiar experiences both intersect with and depart from other racialized and genders people surviving between personhood and objecthood. And to survive in Western white supremacist spaces in a body that is Asian and femme is, in her words, to be quote unquote simultaneously consecrated and desecrated as an inherently aesthetic object. And so it's sort of from that vantage point that I've been sitting with these Chinese phrases, 丢脸 to lose face, 保全面子 to save face, 给面子 to give face, and even 要 or 不要脸 to want or to not want face. There's at least a dozen other turns of phrases describing the demonstration of respect or deference or failure thereof, even a line in Alice Wu's iconic queer Asian film, Saving Face, in which the father says to the daughter, 我这辈子的脸都被你丢光了, or you have lost me my entire lifetime's worth of face. And a few summers ago, I was at an artist residency working on a body of work with this focal point, in hopes of physically, culturally, and emotionally excavating experiences of shame and dysphoria and agency and identity through a queer and trans Chinese diasporic lens by literalizing these actions taken upon a face, particularly through the eyes of this quote unquote yellow woman who lives within my body, even as I do not self-identify as yellow nor woman. I asked, who owns a face? Whose is it to lose and to save? And where has it gone when lost? As quote unquote someone too aestheticized to suffer injury, but so aestheticized that she invites injury, end quote. How does one, borrowing from trans and queer, black and brown ballroom culture, serve one's face instead? And by chance, this artist residency was a stone's throw away from the eastern terminus of the first transcontinental railroad in Council Bluffs, Iowa, which I visited. And by chance, I had planned to drive along I-80 to my next engagement at the western terminus in San Francisco, Jiujingshan. So I was traveling forwards on the colonizer trail to California and yet meeting the ghosts of my ancestor cousins living and working and inevitably loving themselves and others inland. And somehow I realized I was going forwards and backwards at the same time. And it ended up occurring to me that I had not been losing my face in all of these gestures, but perhaps giving it, meaning to show due respect for all of these ancestor cousins of mine along the railway. And the faces aside, I was in fact looking for more sites of extraction hidden in the archives, oil sites, mines, and lumber yards, when I stumbled across one word a dozen times, then a dozen more, and more again. The word was Chinese, a word which looks and sounds nothing like our many words for ourselves, scrawled across maps made by an Anglo-American company to finesse capital out of fire risk. So, at site after site of 19th century extraction, I found traces of Chinese bodies exploited by US white settler infrastructures to dispossess indigenous peoples and lands and to suppress Black resistance and liberation. And that led me to 给面子, to give face to these Chinese diasporic, informal, or popular architectures across the continental US, outside of many of the major cities where we would expect them. In some cases, there's just one remaining building, as in Truckee, where Chinatown was destroyed by fire 3 times. And the last building, an herbal store, is now an office for an interior design firm. Or perhaps reconstructed facsimile as a museum, as in China Camp State Park, where I was sharing the view on that day with a white wedding party in Marin. In others, there's just one street sign, such as Plum Alley outside of a parking garage in Utah, or Ase Avenue, named for Southern Chinese labor organizer in Wyoming. But in nearly all cases of rural Chinese diaspora in the US West, Chinatown was purposefully set on fire and burned to the ground, as in Reno, Nevada, where it was burned down at least twice, the second time by the Reno government themselves. And in nearly all cases of Chinatown burned to the ground, I have been finding traces of us in the insurance maps they drew in case of fire. Sanborn fire insurance maps are some of the most and only detailed plans of Chinese diasporic settlements in the 19th century. And significantly, we were documented not out of interest or care or educational foresight, but because of a lucrative Anglo-American desire to assess fire risk and thus assign insurance value. And in engaging the Sanborn maps, which most often label Chinese structures as hazards, as seen in the green highlight of Chinese-owned laundries in San Rafael, California, um, we might use, in this case, I was using architectural drawing to actually translate and reconstitute what those Chinese diasporic structures, or in truth, a phantom or a shadow of them, might have looked like based on the technical details left by Anglo-American surveyors. So is it 1 or 2 stories? Are there stovepipes or terracotta or brick chimneys, composite or shingled roofs, and so forth? There are virtually no other architectural documents of these Chinese settlements, and yet translating what is there pretty much reveals the limits of translation and revealing what truths are not there. And so these architectural histories and presents reflect that calculus of white supremacist settler colonization in time and space, where on the one hand, the Chinese must go, a rallying cry originating here in California, in many ways the birthplace of anti-Chinese racism in the US. And on the other, in this image, the US Federal Army was stationed in Rock Springs, Wyoming for 14 years following the 1885 Chinese massacre to prevent the Chinese miners employed by the Union Pacific from escaping white racial violence so that they would keep working. So 3 years later, a different opportunity arose here in California and in Woodland in particular when the curator, Sarah Bartlett, who just opened for us today with the Yolo County Historical Collection, herself opened an unlabeled tub of dirt and ceramic shards of Chinese origin within their archives and then wrote to me, lucky me, alongside Sarah in Woodland, California, where there was a small but vibrant Chinatown along the railroad off Main Street. We envisioned an exhibition that would wonder aloud how we might tell stories of Chinese diaspora in North America differently in other ways and toward liberatory futures. And how do we work within archives that are inherently compromised by the systems we seek to unbuild and build anew? So the show Give Face, which combines historic archival objects from the historical collection with contemporary art objects that I created, uses the two in dialogue, past and present, to take steps together into the future. In response to the shards of Chinese origin that Sarah found, I made faces out of porcelain and cobalt oxide. And I tried to give face to the faces that have been lost in what empires have commodified. So, Wu tea from Fujian, which was dumped into the harbor in Boston, raw cane sugar grown on plantations in the Caribbean, where some of the first of our diaspora were imported, and beaver pelts harvested across North America, all of these commodities traded from the Atlantic to the Pacific. And in response to the virulent anti-Chinese rhetoric we found in the papers in the archive, I memorialized the dates and places of their attending crimes in the form of a traditional 4季 or Four Seasons vertical hanging scroll series, reimagined as a ledger of 4季, death anniversaries. So, anti-Chinese massacres, lynchings, arsons, lootings, assaults, mass firings, and exclusionary legislation behind a foreground of California poppies, white sage, coast live oak, and manzanita, blooming and fruiting. And in response to the repeated crimes of arson, in particular, I repurposed a bamboo folding screen, charred and refinished, to frame mirrored glass and reproduce drawings of former Chinatowns, giving face by making visible the neighborhoods that once populated those places, and using reflection as opacity to counter Victorian appropriations of the folding screen as a translucent Orientalist lens through which to view racialized and gendered bodies. To every instance of cultural appropriation from European Japonisme to chinoiserie and beyond, I ended up finding a way to serve my face in a wooden bracelet folding fan I constructed out of the cultural legacies of not only our East Asian ancestors, but queer and trans Black and brown folks who invented ballroom and serving face to critique race and class supremacy and celebrate the continuities of our communities. And to the living histories of Woodland, Chinatown, and all the details that descendants shared with Sarah and I gave my own face again, made of joss paper burned in ritual fire, to my ancestors, theirs, and yours as well, if they'll have me. And I set my altar with offerings we'd make to my mom's parents and theirs, going back 7 generations in Anhui, on the textiles of peoples and liberatory movements that shape my commitment to all people's right to self-determination. And with a single photograph of today's Dead Cat Alley, Woodland's former Chinatown, in place of a Victorian calling card. In response to the clothes made by hand by mothers for their children from the Yolo County Historical Collection archives, with Western fabrics sewn into Chinese patterns, like the clothes my mother made for me, I made a traditional Chinese patchwork quilt, a baijia quilt, sewn together with souvenir t-shirts of Chinese diaspora settlements in California purposefully displaced, looted, destroyed, and often burned to the ground, alongside silk, brocade, and reinforced with fire-resistant tarp. Sarah worked so closely with descendants of Chinese families in Woodland and Winters to bring photographs and belongings, including a mother's wedding dress in the same bright turquoise, bringing memories to life in a Victorian parlor where many of us may never have been welcomed. And to every member of our diaspora lost in the archives, I saved faces in my own folders and filing systems, giving face to every person who lived and loved, whose life and lived experiences persist, even in a name, a number, a word, an image, even in an omission, forever and always. And so these are two images that sort of are signposts for me of how Chinese people and places have been constructed and how we could construct them differently. On the left, a graffitied, closed restaurant like so many that raised us and helped us to survive, titled Oriental Express, behind an actual signpost indicating we might go forward in the other direction. And the other image in Evanston, Mengqing, or a pavilion of dreams, in front of the Union Pacific crest that says Building America. Who builds America and who gets to dream, right? So I'm wrapping up, I promise. So finally, two last images. One, a newer work. These are video stills from giving face last year to the river we call Merced for now in southern Sierra Miwok and northern Paiute homelands in Yosemite National Park, giving face to the tribes whose kinship with this water will outlive U.S. empire, to the Chinese diaspora imported to cook and clean and build Wawona Road, Tioga Road for genocidaires, to all the peoples then and now fighting for sovereignty and dignity everywhere. And then lastly, back in the archives, I remember the day that I found three words scrawled on a 1904 Sanborn map of Reno, Nevada, the Chinatown that had already been burned down once in 1878 and would be burned down again in 4 years. The words were Chinese vegetable garden. And I cried when I read it. I felt I needed to know who wrote those words. Was he, and it was almost certainly a he, struck by its size, its abundance, its smells and sounds? Was he disgusted? Did he consider it a nuisance, a hazard? Why did he write this down on this fire insurance map, right? Did he see the gardeners as human? I wasn't necessarily uncovering something for the first or even the 100th time. Many people have written about cultural exchanges between Chinese, Shoshone, Paiute, Ute, and Anglo-Americans in the Sierras. But I felt I had, in looking at this page, caught the gaze and held momentarily across 100 years the gaze of another person looking at my ancestor cousins or our ancestor cousins, we might say, and writing by hand these three words. And I don't really know the exact circumstances for these words and how they made it onto this map, but I know that my own Tai Tai, my Popo, my fumu, my mom and my dad have also tended to generations of Taiyuan, of vegetable gardens, of these diasporic translations of ourselves, our memories and our communities as seeds pass through hands in earth and sea and sky, unfurling across space and time. So I'll stop there. And I believe
Right.
I'm passing to Connie.
Yes.
Thank you so much, Bz. That was wonderful. Um, Such a beautiful presentation, and I loved, yeah, just like learning more about the trajectory of your work and how, yeah, how deeply you're working with these critical fabulations. And yeah, it was just a beautiful presentation. So thank you. Um, okay, I am gonna share my screen. Give me a second. I'm also gonna set a timer, just to keep myself on track. I've been doing a lot of like scripted talks recently, so I'm trying to not do that as much because it's yeah. So but when I freestyle, I can run out of time quickly, so I'm just gonna set a timer. Okay. Okay, there's still gonna be a little bit of reading, just because there are certain things that I can't quite memorize. But okay. So, yeah, thank you all for being here. Okay. So in her essay, The Source of Self-Regard, Toni Morrison writes that in all of our education, there is a kind of epistemic progression. She writes that we move from data to information to knowledge to wisdom, and that being able to distinguish between each of these is the project of what she calls serious education, while imaginative power is the main force that moves us from information to knowledge. And so imagination, Morrison argues, personalizes information. It makes it intimate. It metabolizes what we think of as data and synthesizes it into knowledge. And so this question of what constitutes knowledge is, I think, the driving force behind a lot of my work. What constitutes knowledge during a time when, say, generative AI makes it easy for anyone to feign expertise? What does it mean to know a place when drone and satellite technology can grant anyone with a smartphone a God's eye view of places we never visited. And what is the role of the body within this new and surreal epistemological formation? And so I think my work is often an attempt to respond to these questions through a set of embodied creative practices for inquiring into what it means to know a place and to understand my own relationship to it. So I'm a multidisciplinary artist, experimental filmmaker, and educator based out of the San Francisco Bay Area on the unceded lands of the Ohlone people. And I often start presentations with pictures of my studio because I feel like it gives a pretty immediate glimpse into the multidisciplinary nature of my practice. And so on the broadest level, my work deals with the porous interface between memory, culture, and place, and the ways in which mythologies and landscape are in mutual dialogue. I work across disciplines, and my projects have taken the form of wall-sized maps, which I'll primarily be talking about today. Here are a few of them. And I also work with, my projects have also taken the form of community mapping and participatory design and sculpture workshops, as well as analog animated films, dystopian fake documentaries, and audiovisual installations. So I typically will install my video work in sort of unconventional objects or containers, such as planter boxes, laundry carts, and also like multi-channel audiovisual installations. I am especially attentive to the geopolitics of labor, having had family members who were undocumented immigrants to this country, and my mapping practice in particular focuses on surfacing marginalized and invisibilized histories. So today I'll primarily be talking about my mapping and community-based work. But first, a little bit of genealogy or lineage, I guess, because I'm obsessed with lineage. And so my artistic practice is rooted in a diasporic concept of home and attempts to find agency and meaning within a chronic experience of dislocation. So I was born in an industrial city in the north of China called Luoyang, and I grew up in Rust Belt, Pennsylvania, and then the area, frequently spending my summers in China during my teens. I found my sense of home constantly redefined amidst the emotional whiplash of always returning, quote unquote, to a home that saw me as an outsider. When I, quote unquote, went back to China, I was viewed as a Lawai. And when I went, quote unquote, home to Boston, or I mean, even now, California, I'm, asked whether or not I speak English. Sometimes after I've spoken, after I've said something in English. And so when I first immigrated to the US, this was a sense of, for the first like 2 decades of my life, possibly 3 decades of my life, I would say that this was a sense of like alienation for me. But over the past couple of years, I've actually come to see this as, this sense of like always being a guest as actually a position in which, one can actually find a great sense of agency. And that is very much influenced by the work of many Indigenous scholars, such as Dylan Robinson, who's a Stolo, and an amazing sound studies and Indigenous studies scholar. So when I first immigrated to the States, my mom actually supplemented my public school education by partially homeschooling me in Chinese, using textbooks that my grandfather mailed us from China. And so my earliest sense of self was forged both through American and what I would say Chinese propaganda. So I learned about the Pilgrims and the Mayflower at the same time as I learned about Chairman Mao and the Long March to Yan'an. I learned about Thanksgiving dinner at the same time as communists worked communes in the Chinese countryside. And so these questions of knowledge and power, like whose knowledge counts as worthy of inheritance and which kinds of knowledge get to shape our world, are at the heart of my work. So a couple of map-like drawings I've made over the years include a star chart. So this one is about 16 feet long of plantation economies made for a show in Malaysia last year. a circular calendar depicting plants and animals that have been foundational to liberation struggles around the world, based off of, yeah, sort of like uh, both acupuncture diagrams as well as like theosophic paintings in a European tradition, and maps, a map of pollution and environmental justice activism in the San Francisco Bay Area. And so I see my maps as collages that negotiate between public, personal, and land-based knowledge. And for today, I'll focus on two maps in particular. So the first of these is a map that I made in 2023 called How to Make a Golden State. This work, which is now held in the map collection at Stanford, is a 9-foot long map that traces Asian farm worker history in California since the mid 1800s. And it shows how East Asian, South Asian, and Southeast Asian farm workers have been foundational to California's agricultural development since the 1800s, often alongside Chicano and Latino workers. The map also documents numerous instances of anti-Asian violence in rural parts of the state, especially amidst the passage of the Chinese Exclusion Act and Japanese internment during World War II. So as I think these also mentioned in their presentation, lynchings, arson, and other forms of domestic terrorism constituted the daily reality for these immigrants who helped make California the wealthiest state in the nation and the agricultural engine of the US. But I think the biggest discovery, and maybe like most amazing discovery that I made working on this map, is that Asian American history in the US is actually very tightly braided with American labor history. So many of the most successful and famous farm strikes on the West Coast were actually led by Filipino farm workers who were feared by big corporate growers, as documented in the journalist Carrie McWilliams' 1939 expose of migratory farm labor called Factories in the Field. So even though this work, How to Make a Golden State, is a map of Asian farm worker history, it also contains a secondary narrative, one which counters mainstream notions of Asian laborers as silent, invisible, and marginal. I started working on this map because I felt that this information would change how I thought about California, which has been my home for about 15 years now. I wanted to know, how would I look at Sonoma County differently if I were to center the Asian American histories of the region, or Kern County, or Sutter County? And my research entailed visits to rural historic Chinatowns, interviews with local historians, digging through the archives of historical societies and government databases, and examining precipitation and composition, soil composition maps, and reading academic scholarship and news articles. So since finishing How to Make a Golden State, I have since created a risograph version of this map, which I've distributed freely as a print. And over the past few years, I've also been working to expand this project, I think in conversation with Bz's work, into a room-sized cartographic installation that will trace Chinese farm worker history across North and Central America, Hawaii, and the Caribbean, foregrounding narratives of multiracial solidarity amidst xenophobia and white supremacist violence over the past 2 centuries. So yeah, the reference to Chinese like grocers in the Delta in Sinners was pretty amazing to see on screen, and that is definitely one of the histories that will be in this project. The Pacific Northwest will also feature pretty prominently in this work, given the deep intertwined histories of Chinese and indigenous peoples in the region. So, for example, many First Nations communities actually nursed injured Chinese railroad workers back to health after they were left to die among railroad tracks, and Chinese farmers leased land from First Nations in British Columbia starting in the 1950s. So a companion piece to How to Make a Golden State is what I think of as a memory map painting that's called Strawberry Fields Forever, which was originally commissioned for a show at the Santa Cruz Museum of Art and History in 2024. It's about 7 feet wide and 6 feet tall, and it's a map of Watsonville, which is an important site of Filipino-American history that is also sometimes called the strawberry capital of the world, because the berry mega corporation Driscoll's is headquartered there. And so as part of that research, we actually visited the Driscoll's corporate headquarters, really strange place. tried all sorts of like experimental berry varieties, like a champagne rosé berry, like strawberry, and a pineapple strawberry. I just like the champagne rosé strawberry was a little weird, but like actually quite delicious. And uh, and so this map was made entirely from oral history interviews with the descendants of the Manong and the Manong. So the first generation of Filipino migrants to immigrate to the US. So my process of making this map entailed going through hundreds of pages of oral history transcripts, um, site visits, cyanotypes of regional flora, taking analog photography, archival deep dives, conversations with descendants, and reading through. Um, sorry, I already mentioned that. I already mentioned reading through all the transcripts. And so all of this was made possible by the work of a team called Watsonville's in the Heart, which is a multi-year NEH-funded project that was led by a team of historians and sociologists at the University of California, Santa Cruz, who invited me to join for numerous interviews and site visits through the region. And so, as someone who is not Filipina, but was invited to participate in this project through one of the project team leads, I approached my mapping process by asking myself, who is this map for? Because surely it's not for me, an outsider. But most maps are created for outsiders, people who don't know anything about a place and are in need of an orientation. If you really know a place, you don't really need a map, right? And so I thought, while making this, I thought about the extensive collaboration that the Watsonville's in the Heart team cultivated with the dozens of families and descendants in the Pajaro Valley, and the many community members who contributed their stories and family photos to the archive, which I was generously granted access to in order to make this work. And so I wanted those who contributed to the archive, as well as their loved ones, to be able to see their own stories in the map. I wanted their experience of the map to be intimate and embodied in the way that their relationship to Watsonville was. And so this is a schematic diagram that I made of the streets that people mentioned in relation to the farms that people worked on. And so everything, all the streets on this map are streets that were mentioned in the interviews. The relief, these sort of like patches of relief prints, like those are based off of where people mentioned, encountering certain um, kinds of crops, so somebody mentioned, so for example, like people talked about, working on an asparagus farm by Beach Street. And so that was where it would appear on the map. And, um, and so this was a pretty amazing experience for me to be sort of like doing this community mapping work in conversation with the community. And um, and I think one of the most transformative or rewarding moments of working on this project was actually during the opening of this show when um, a woman who was the daughter of the woman whose reference photo I use for this picture, um, yeah, was taking photos with her son and father in front of the painting, and said, we are our ancestors' wildest dreams, and yeah, and said it was really, yeah, that it made her really happy to see her mom in this work. And so so I'm at 15 minutes now. And so I think in the interest of time, I'm gonna just wrap up here. I have some more like, yeah, I have this Chinatown, or this community arts project that I did in Chinatown a couple years ago that is also one of my favorites, but I will leave that for the conversation portion. So thank you. And I will pass it to, I guess, yeah, Evelyn.
Cool. Thank you. Uh, that was beautiful. We have doing 15 or 10. I mean, and I'm just gonna roll with it. But okay, I'm gonna share my screen. It is definitely not as structured, and I might skip or not skip based on the interest of time. Um, so I'm also gonna set a timer. All right, cool. So, okay, so I am my name is Evelyn, and thanks everyone for being here. I'm also I also make videos, mostly camera-based work, and also video installations. Um, so I'll begin my this talk with some of the photos I've taken in this very particular place of Hanford, California, in Central Valley, about a bit southeast of Fresno, where there is still an alleyway standing that used to be the Chinatown of um that used to be Hanford's Chinatown, or it still is Hanford's Chinatown. So I began going there, like what Biz was saying, looking for these places in rural California, that still have these old Chinatowns standing. Um, I A bit background information. I actually grew up in China, in Hangzhou, till I was 18, and I came to the US for college. So a lot of these histories, of course, very unfamiliar to me, until I started doing my project and finding out all these places that Connie and Biz both have talked about, all across at least the West Coast. And then I began visiting Hanford, particular China Alley, since 2018. And then took these photos of the place. And it is, of course, in agricultural. Hanford is very agricultural. So then I also was taking a lot of photos in the nearby farmlands, um, learning about what is produced. There are a lot of nuts, so almonds, pistachios, and are being made in the nearby farmlands. And in China Alley in particular, there is because there's a whole alleyway still existing, unlike a lot of other rural Chinatowns where there's maybe one building left or maybe there's nothing left anymore. I actually have was spending a lot of time visiting the temple there, um, and helping them doing some archival work, documenting the artifacts that they have left. Um, until there was an unfortunate fire that happened in 2021. And then this is used to be the same photo here. The same doorway behind her was actually set on fire by an arsonist, and it tore through the second floor of the temple building. So a lot of these photos are just taken over the years. And the main caretaker, Camille Wayne, who was in the photo that I showed earlier, have now passed. So, um, yeah, I've over time built a very deep relationship with the place. Um, and yeah, I'll let the photos speak for themselves. This is the Tulare Lake that reemerged from a few years ago's storm. This is a photo I took of the temple after a lot of the items have been moved out. They're currently in storage in a warehouse in Los Angeles. So this is what the temple used to look like. And I took this photo in 2019 maybe. And this is the immediate photo I took after the fire. So I was at the time trying to make this short film about, actually not about Hanford, but like in China Alley is what I wanted to do. But because of the fire, I had to change my plan. So what I did was I found these old photos. There I have a big collection of photos from the place, and I wanted to project these archival photos onto the space that is now unfortunately burned. Thinking about what who used to live here, who used to come by, and who might have want to see um even though there was a fire, that there's still people taking care of this place. So this is films stills from this short film I made called Let Me Take You Home. And I was thinking about what Biz said about and all of you, both of you actually, the historical and then the fictional. And because a lot of times we don't have access to a lot of the information, um, what can we try to imagine what happened? And what could have happened and what might happen in the future. So this is old video taken in down in the same temple, and I projected it onto this framed donor's plaque sort of. And then this is like the same clock that was in here as well. Yeah, so this is a short video that I made. I think I want to skip all this part. I think I'm gonna talk about two particular work in this. Okay, so in 2024, my collaborator Coffee Kang worked on this video installation work at this the space in LA. And we visited a few places, Angel Island, the Chinese Massacre Cove in Idaho along the Snake River where 30 more than 30 miners were killed by a white mob, and then their bodies were thrown into the river. So this particular work was inspired from our trip there where I printed out these photographs, one taken at the Chinese Massacre Cove in Idaho, and I projected it. Sorry, I put this fabric underneath a water tank that has a wave maker where the water moves, and I shine a line on it, and then the light being reflected from the tank is then reflected onto the fabric that's hung on the wall. And then the fabric, this photo that's hung on the wall was taken by me in during a trip to Canton in 2023, where I try to find the ancestral village of folks I've met in Hanford, even though my closest contact, she actually doesn't remember the name of her ancestral village, but I was able to find the ancestral village of their same last name. And I was just walking around the village is where I took this photo. So I was thinking about the different like the connections that I was able to make by going to these places, and sometimes in a way like it became less about the exact places I'm going to, but sort of become like I was more interested in a way about like my journey traveling to these places and what does it mean as a person who, of course, did not come from the region that most early Chinese immigrants came from, visiting these places, and what does it mean, 150 years later, me coming here as a student, the different type of journeys that we're taking, um, despite me again being an illegal alien in this country. So another piece I would like to talk about is this what do you call it, vitrine that I made for the show. So this became a combination of both my personal belongings and also cultural belongings from Hanford. So this has the 白鸽票 or Pakapu tickets that are from Hanford, and also like herbs from Hanford, and like writing materials, all this like day-to-day use objects from China Alley. But also I have this is my Qipao, and and I wrote, so basically this letter that I have is actually here. I have it with me. So a lot of you, I'm sure a lot of you all know about Paper Sons and Daughters, aka Chinese folks that came through immigration during Chinese Exclusion Act, where they were not allowed to, and of course they fabricated all these stories. So I was thinking about in order to get into the US or get back into the US. So I mocked a sort of affidavit from the time that would have been what looked like from the time. And I borrowed a typewriter, and I wrote about um, myself, and I put like photos of myself, and I even made a I'm blanking on the name, embosser, um that is uh a notary, sorry, whatever that's called. And I wrote the date where I last came into the US. So this was like my attempt at fabricating a story and imagining what it must have been like, drawing the parallels of my own personal journey in relation to those that I am closely examining. Of course, there are differences because once you read it, like, it's obviously in 2023. But anyways, I want to make more of these. Hopefully I can do that soon. And then lastly, I want to talk about this project that I've actually been doing in collaboration with 1882 Foundation, who's a co-host of this talk. I've been working with collaborator, where's Jeff? Oh, we don't have her name on it. Never mind. Jeffrey Warren, who actually invited me first when he was doing his Library of Congress residency of using VR to again reimagine historic rural Chinatowns, and also sorry, that's what we first collaborated on. And this is actually a still from the VR that he and I created using, again, Sembor map that Biz talked a lot about as a foundational like basis, and also historical photographs. So you can see in these buildings, they look like what they are today, but they have like people on them. They're not exact. Um, they're not like truthful like to what it looked like, because a lot of times you don't know what they really look like. For example, on this left building here, it's literally a mirrored image, because that's the best we could find. Um, so we started a collaboration on that, and then he during our conversation, he became interested in this one stool that I made a long time ago. I guess this is the photo of the stool that I made. Um, because in an attempt to like replicate these stools that were found everywhere in China Alley. I'm not a woodworker, but he is. So after he found out that I made this, we became like we became really obsessed, even more obsessed with this object. So these are stools that were like everywhere in the temple. This is a photo I took before the fire. And in this old photograph of China Alley, you can see all these folks sitting on these stools. This is another restaurant in China Alley. You also see these stools. They were like just sort of everywhere. So, what we did is we decided to do a stool workshop. We did one in Hanford and one in Los Angeles, where we invited folks to come and just learn how to build these stools from scratch. And none of the participants are woodworkers, I believe. But it was this very communal process where you're like coming together and like, just working with your hands. And it was also folks of different ages coming together, which I thought was a very beautiful thing. And these are the the stools that we all made together in the workshop in Los Angeles. And Jeff and I are continuing to make more work in other rural Chinatowns. And we're basically trying to figure out creative ways of engaging with histories that are sort of different from perhaps just going to a history museum and looking at artifacts. So this is our sort of an attempt at um, bringing people together and using tactile ways instead of just visual and audio to learn more about histories. Yeah, sorry, I feel like I'm rambling a lot, but I'm gonna pause there and hand it over to um, uh, Spencer. Sorry. All right.
Thank you, Evelyn. How are we doing on time right now? I know it's like 11:58.
We have until 12:30. So we have a little bit more time.
Okay.
I built in a buffer just in case. So we should be okay still.
Okay, cool. Well, this is really cool. Thanks everyone for coming. There's so many things you could be doing on your Sunday, and the fact that we're all here really, I think, is really special to talk about something that means so deeply to us. Like, I spent some time, researching and like cyber stalking all the artists on this panel and reading y'all's bios and stuff. So it definitely hits so much harder hearing you guys like talk about it. So I'm really appreciative, and it's such a like a well like intentioned and thought out group of people. So shout out 1882 also and Yolo County for bringing together this group. Um, yeah, and also something I wrote down here was like I noticed a lot of the work is kind of based in memories, right? Trying to like find that. And I thought uh I feel very seen because I think in a lot of my work I'm also kind of trying to figure out what to do with these memories. And it's kind of interesting that all these children of the diaspora are also kind of drawn to these things. Like I don't know, I wonder why we're also sentimental. Um, but yeah, I think my name is SK. What do you call me, Spencer? I'm a filmmaker, film director. But I guess my main quest is running this thing that I call Dream State with some of my best friends here in the Bay Area. Um, and it's also kind of interesting to think about myself being in this group too, because I know that everyone here is so maybe close to their roots. Some of you guys are actually from the motherland, and I was born and raised in Sacramento, California, and I uh, I remember like once telling my friend that I never thought I would ever make any kind of art related to being Asian American or being Chinese, and to the point where like I grew up like a 20-minute drive from Locke, California. And I remember I'd go on these like car rides along the river, the Delta with my sister and walk around Locke and just think like this is so different from how I feel inside. Like, and no wonder like a kid like that grows up feeling kind of like this isn't my story. So but yeah, I'm gonna share some what's it called? Some slides too. Yeah, so Dream State, that's the collective. And so Dream State is a collective of third culture kids. We like to say that we make, digital art, films, exhibitions, programs, all kind of with the intent of, making the world a safer place to dream. I think we're really interested in this idea of the politics of dreaming, who gets to dream, who doesn't, all through this lens of, just these kids of immigrants. And you can go to the next slide. So the idea for Dream State kind of came from a moment in my life where I was learning a lot about my grandma and her journey from coming from poverty in Hong Kong with my dad and his siblings and my grandfather to Sacramento. And um, I'd hear these like crazy stories, like her pedaling on the streets of Hong Kong, you know, house burning down in Hong Kong, working the night shifts at the tomato canning factory in Sacramento, to the point where the smell of tomatoes like made her want to vomit. And I would ask her like, Grandma, what, like, how did it feel? How did it feel when your house burned down or when you're working at the tomato canning factory? Because um, being, the generation I'm from, I'm always thinking about like how did it feel? Like what is the purpose? And she would look at me and just be like feel, like what do you mean feel? Like there was no time to feel, like life was hard. And I think that's something that a lot of me and my contemporaries relate on because um, I think the truth of the matter is that the people that came before us didn't have the time, the resources, the privilege to dream. They came here for the American dream, which is kind of something very different than the way that we think of dreaming now. And I no one taught us how to dream. No one taught us how to feel. And I think that a lot of the work that we do is almost trying to like figure out what do we do with these dreams and these memories that were passed down to us. Because at the end of the day, when you are severed from, your motherlands, like I am, my only perception of being Chinese is just based off memories and traditions that were told that are me. But what do we really do with that in a new context of this country? Um, maybe you do. They're like famous in Sacramento. Um, Sacramento royalty. You can change the slide. But yeah, we talk about the third culture. The first culture being, the culture of my parents, Chinese. The second culture is, for us in this context, America. But the third culture is really like a blend of the first and second and resulting in something new and unique. And I think this really made sense to me when I learned that even the term Chinese American, it was only made in like the 1960s. Like, like the West Side Story is older than the term Chinese American. And like that is mind-boggling because it means that there's no context for us to draw on, and this is something that we're kind of telling in this very moment. But in that sense, there's almost like a freedom in us being able to, liberate ourselves and, tell the story that is true to us. And I think that was kind of the conflict I was experiencing a lot when I was younger. Is like these memories, these things you're telling me that I am, don't feel like me. But I think now we're trying to create what is us right now. Um, so if you go to the next slide, please. Yeah, dream state. We talk a lot about our inner children, the kids that were made in this new context, and how we are still these kids, um, and try to make a world that feels safe for these kids to dream and the ones that come forward after. But yeah, we're a team of filmmakers, experience designers, art directors, producers. Um, yeah, just kind of running around, hyper ambitious kids. Making a ruckus in the Bay Area. And if you go to the next slide, um, I think, with us, like, I think Connie said it too. Like, I don't think we really have the answers. I think the world is so crazy, but the context that in the lens that we can see the world through, ha helps us ask these really pertinent questions. Like, what do we do with the dreams passed down to us? When a dream comes undone, like the American dream around us, what do we grow in their place? Who gets the dream, who doesn't? Who are we in the eyes of others, and what happens when we fail? And I feel like a lot of our work is kind of just unraveling these questions, almost like a thesis. And by the end of it, we kind of come to our own conclusions and an acceptance of like who we are and our identity. Um, Next slide, please. We do it through these kind of like these three different branches. One is the experiences, whether it be activations, exhibitions. We recently, our last show at the Asian Art Museum broke the record for attendance. It was about the American dream, unraveling it, the idea of people of color having to come to the table more perfect, more presentable, but how we're all constant works in progresses. We run programs for rising artists to help them also find their power. And all that kind of coming together with digital storytelling. And this kind of comes from my love of media, pop culture, also my filmmaking, and how we kind of bring that all together and create these like dreamscapes that kind of blend between, real life and the internet. Uh, You can skip. Yeah, but yeah, digital storytelling. We use this kind of metaphor of pigeons in our work a lot. Pigeons kind of like being this like black sheep animal, but also a metaphor for immigrants. You know, they would say, but these two populations that they're disease ridden, there's too many of them. Um, and likewise, if you were to destroy a pigeon's home, it would just relocate and rebuild because it's hyper resilient and intelligent, just like immigrants. If you go to the next slide, please. I would love to show this video. I think this video kind of describes a lot about the work that we do. This was a short film that we made.
You want to hear it?
Mhm.
Good. Do you want to talk before I play?
Uh, it's a short film that we made that kind of announced the exhibition at the Asian Art Museum. That's all I'll say for now.
Say, have you ever experienced a dream like this? A dream so powerful, it came true. It's me, dream attorney Batty Ann Fong. And if this sounds like you might have also worried. When will the dream fall apart? When will I wake up? When will something go wrong? Well, no need to fret. Keep the dream strong and call Ann Fong.
I was in between jobs, searching hopelessly for the position that might fulfill me. No Roomba vacuum, no Keurig, and blood pressure. But then I called Anne.
You can't scheme if you're not in the dream. Call now.
I never felt like I was enough, that I had to come to every table more complete, more finished.
Call me.
Accepting that the American dream has completed me, I now have no worries.
Side effects of maintaining the American dream may include realizing your safe little house is just a museum of sacrifice, raising the perfect child who doesn't know your language, finding that your dream home sits on land stolen twice and gifted once, missing calls from your ancestors, flipping through your life like a brochure someone else wrote, and high blood pressure. Really high blood pressure.
So maintain the dream, sweetie, or else you might wake up.
She part.
Yeah. So and Fong, that was a trip. Yeah, I think, you know, with like a video like this, you know, it's kind of working on different levels for us. One is like the kind of shared experience that a lot of us had, you know, where you're asleep on the couch, it's like 2 a.m. You kind of wake up and like you see like George Lopez jumping up on a trampoline, and you're like, am I dreaming right now? And this idea of like not being able to decipher like what is real and what wasn't, you know, even when it comes to like um your family's journey to this country. The idea of like Anne Fong kind of like being uh somehow the most like recognizable, in my opinion, like the most recognizable seen Asian American person in California because her billboards are everywhere. How she kind of owns like a piece of our consciousness in the back of our head. All the way to like, like what does it mean to like when you come here for the American dream, like what is also sacrificed in that exchange. But yeah, that's kind of like example of like what we kind of do with Dream State, which is like a lot of drawing from, you know, our childhood experiences, our shared experiences, bringing that into like the kind of political landscape that we're in, and also tying it down to like our own like personal identities as Asian Americans. Um, yeah, next slide. We do but then we kind of bring that in. So that film kind of was like actually set in the museum, and then the actual exhibition at the end appears in the museum. So it's kind of blending the digital with the reality. If you can go next slide. Quick shout out to our experienced designer, Ray Tang. She's on the call right now. She helped design a lot of this. It's really a huge collective that makes Dream State. You can show that video. Yeah. This was really cool. We started a flash mob in the museum. Um, and I think like, we're talking about a lot of like really heavy concepts, but I think being able to package it in a way that's like very whimsical and like really led by joy. I remember kind of like dancing with everyone in the middle of that institution and just feeling like, man, this is the first time in my life I've ever truly felt free. And I think that is like what we're trying to also like kind of help people find in themselves, like what makes you feel free? What is the ways that we can like kind of navigate the systems that we're in and, find our own purpose and, ultimately like, build that village that, uplifts everyone. Yeah. All right. Yeah, and then we have our programs. You don't have to play this video, but pretty much it's like and with all this, we're trying to also, build these like artist programs, these programs for youth, trying to help, build up the future of the Bay Area because we believe that, artists and creatives have a really important role in the society and the future that we're heading into. I like to say like doctors heal bodies, and policymakers change policy, but I think it's really the creatives that, inspire people in the heart to start movements to make change. So trying to really like empower young creatives, young AAPI creatives to step into their leadership and use their creativity to find, creative solutions to the problems that we face in this like kind of modern, this new world that we're entering. But yeah, and then I think you skip. It's good. We don't have to go into that. But yeah, that's pretty much it. That's Dream State. I try to be very concise with that, but um yeah, that's what me and this group of people are doing.
Thank you so much, all four of you, for coming and sharing your art, what you've been working on. I'm going to open it up to the panelists to ask each other questions while I sort of gather some questions from the audiences here. So feel free to unmute yourselves and ask each other questions and start discussing that way.
Okay, I can start.
You.
I just wanted to say thank you again, all three of you, for joining, and everyone 1882 and Yolo County Historical Collection for hosting, and everybody who's on the call and chiming in and being so attentive and engaged with us. And it's just like feels like there's so many amazing threads to follow here. But maybe, I mean, there some of the things that I wrote down from each of you. Connie, you were speaking about what constitutes knowledge and what's the role of the body in these knowledge producing systems and paradigms. Evelyn, you were talking about like how do we engage with history and make those connections again in this sort of embodied making space kind of way outside of the traditional institutional context. And SK, the last question about like what makes you feel free, especially after you started by talking about your grandmother and there not being time to feel. Is that so resonant, And so going from like even cultivating the space to feel. And maybe that's why, to your question, we're all a little sentimental, right? To then how do you feel free? Was really powerful to hear as you were describing your practice. Um, and then the other question that Connie you had kind of posed was like how being or statement you had made was like being a guest can be a really great position of agency.
Mm.
So I also just wanted to bring that back in. This is not a, obviously like this is like I'm like just processing everything. This isn't a full question yet. But maybe it's sort of somewhere between like what makes you feel free and like, you know, and thoughts on like what does it mean to be a guest, you know, and how does that become a position of agency? I think, you know, I've been pondering myself like moving from this perpetual foreigner trope that is imposed upon us to also, you know, to shifting that as thinking about being a guest, you know, in a way as well. So still not totally a question, but pondering and would be interested to hear from you all like what makes you feel free? Spent SK's question. And, you know, maybe like how are the ways that, you know, we express our agency, whether like through this lens of being a guest or otherwise.
Mm. Damn, I think you just unlocked something for me. That was that was really cool. I've actually never even said describe dream state in that way of like what makes you feel free. I never even made that connection to like my grandma as well. So I want to say thank you for that too, the observation. Um, yeah, I know. I want to hear what makes everyone feel free. Can I popcorn it? I'm gonna shoot that over to Evelyn.
That's a tough one. I honestly seldom feel free, unfortunately, if I'm being honest.
That's
Um,
real.
yeah, but I think there's this like yearning, I guess, perhaps that is what I'm gonna settle with in terms of feeling free. Uh, but I yes, the perpetual foreigner trope and it it is very interesting to turn it around and say we are guests and we are guests of this land. All of us, at least on this panel, are guests of this land. Um, uh, so how do we act like the guests, you know, by perhaps not taking full ownership of this land? Um, I guess it's a perpetual dialogue of like our relationship with it, and then the other people that are also inhabiting this land. So yeah, um, that could be a somewhat of superpower, you know? Yeah. Now popcorn to Connie.
Yeah, thank you for that, Evelyn. I mean, yeah, I mean, I think this question of like what makes you feel free is an amazing one. And yeah, and thank you, Bz, for synthesizing, you know, all these different threads. I feel like that takes a lot of labor. So I appreciate you doing that. And especially on the fly. And yeah, I mean, I feel like I have to agree with Evelyn around this feeling of like often not feeling very free, especially in this country. So um yeah, I mean, I feel like I feel the most free when I feel like I have a sense of agency over the present. You know, like we can't control the future. That's impossible. And however much, you know, people might you know, our overlords might try to say that they can do that, but like really like none of us can control the future. And so like all we really have agency over is the present and how we respond to the present and how we respond to the past, you know, which is constantly asserting itself in the present. Um, and so I think I feel free is when I am spacious, when I have that yeah, when I feel like I can be present. And that is something that I think about a lot with regard to my family. And yeah, I mean, the story that you shared, SK, about your grandma, like, really resonated with me and moved me. I yeah, like, I've been thinking about this a lot with, my family and my grandparents, like my grandma, um, my maternal grandma, my Lao or my Waipoa. She died a few weeks ago, and she had a very, very difficult life. She, lived through World War One, World War Two, lived through Japanese, like, 15, or maybe it was 14 years of Japanese occupation. Um, like, lived through the Cultural Revolution, which is very hard on my mother's family. And she, yeah, and she was um, uh, living in a nursing home and unable to leave her bed by herself for the past 5 years. And I, yeah, and she had a lot of anger. Like, she was a really, really angry woman. And I feel like, like, that's totally understandable for what she went through and what she witnessed. And I see how that anger passes through my family. I see how, there's so much unprocessed trauma and grief. Um, and the ghosts of these traumas are still very much within our families. And it's and I feel extraordinarily lucky to have the life that I do, even when I feel like, you know, the US is in a spiral and we're all going down with it. And but like, even so, like, we like, my life is such a miracle. And I and so, yeah, sorry, this is I don't think I'm answering your question at all. I'm just kind of like, I just
I think you are.
but no, but I think this question of, like, what makes you feel free is constantly what I'm trying to understand. And, this position of guesthood is also something that I've been trying to navigate for the past couple of years as well. Because, like, sometimes it is very lonely feeling. Sometimes it is really alienating still. Like, even as I try to position it as as a place from which one can find agency, rather than constantly being at, like buffeted about by, like, immigration law and all the shit that we don't really have a ton of control over. But I think the sense of responsibility that comes with being a guest, um, is 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 really, like, beautiful and humbling, actually. And because I feel like, because yeah, um, like, I feel like it can be easy to take a place for granted if you feel like you belong there. And as someone who doesn't really feel like they've belonged anywhere for the last several, like, since I was, like, a child living in China, like, I I think you see a lot of things as a guest. There's a sense of clarity that I feel like that position can afford, and a sense of, like, yeah, and that sense of responsibility of, it's like, how do I be a good guest? What can be what kind of agency do I have as a guest rather than a host, and can I learn how to be a better host by being a better guest? I feel like those are all questions that I'm constantly thinking about, in any of the work that I make. So, yeah, thank you for that question. And I feel like I just monologued for like 5 minutes. So,
No, I think it's great to, like, think about these concepts of, I mean, I think you all touched on it in all of your presentations, like the idea of, like, who gets to create knowledge, who gets to dream, like, how do we exist and all be guests? I think you're all touching on very similar things. So I think It's productive musings. And I think it leads into some of our audience questions as well. So I'm gonna pull one of those if you guys are ready. I'm also gonna send it in the chat because some of these are quite lengthy, so you don't have to remember what I said at the beginning of my sentence. So, how does your positionality, you as an individual, familial history, personal environments affect, influence, and shape your approach to your craft, the topics that you cover? And that's just sort of for anyone.
I think that's like very much in relation to what we just were talking about, like us being guests. We all, I think, sort of, yeah, I think we all covered like our uh background a little bit. So I think at least for me, it's like like my actual physical freedom is very much tied to my status as a visa holder. So a lot of places I can and cannot go, um my in making this work was also very much um because of that confine of freedom that I feel present day, and also I know that our ancestors felt back in the day. Um, I in my work at least I try to think about like it's unavoidable that I'm going to draw comparisons between my journey and then the journeys of the folks that we're like all of us are discussing. Um, but then there are also very big differences because of like my socioeconomic statuses and also the current geopolitical landscape. Um, yeah, but it is like unfortunately to me it's like a lot of these things that we're like discovering like people being barred in it's like has not changed unfortunately. Just this country is like, is not learning from its past. But anyways, that's my short answer to that question.
I'll jump in. Just the last thing you said, Evelyn. I think Sarah and I, when we started working on the exhibition in Woodland, had a couple of conversations being like, do we, just like, how do we make this feel present? How do we bridge like this history and have people like feel like they can, draw the strands into today? And then the current regime came back into power, and everyone who comes to the show is just like, oh, I'm seeing this today on the news. And in fact, it's been happening, kind of under the mainstream radar, this entire time in ways that we're perhaps many of us were not paying as close attention to as we should have. So there's a lot. It's like the history is very present that all of us are working to. And so maybe like speaking to this question about positionality and how does it affect and influence and shape my approach to my craft, as well as like that initial question, kind of SK that you posed to everyone about how do we, what makes us feel free. I think for me as well, in addition to like resonating with what was shared by you all, is like that clarity, like trying to see through narratives that are imposed upon us. And then the way to do that for any of us is really to gain and seek and gain clarity also about our own positions, including the privileges. For example, like across this group, and this is part of the thoughtfulness, I think, of bringing the four of us together is like we have a range of experience. I'm a US born, US passport holder and have made trips to China to see family members where my cousins, who are visa holders in the US currently, have not been able to return for maybe 10 years, right? And so what that flip of what you think the connectiveness would be, depending on generation and immigration status, is very disorienting as well. There's so many unexpected like 180s, in within the like centuries of trans-Pacific migration. And, in many people's histories, there's like, even like generations where they've returned to the homeland and then come back 2 generations later, so it's not a linear thing. And the more that I think I lean into the specificity or thinking about like specific um, materials or stories from within my own specific families, the more I find um, that people are able to connect to it, right? So it's a little counterintuitive sometimes to think it's like, oh, we should dilute it so that everyone can access it. But actually, I think it's those details in each of our stories that help other people find that detail within their own story that becomes even more powerful. And I think also the discomfort of, I think this country as a whole has a lot of difficulty with feeling uncomfortable and that, and that's the racism and the white supremacy at work is like not wanting to look at something if it creates discomfort in ourselves. So like leaning into like, yes, we are guests, no matter which generation we are, and can we move through feelings of discomfort or even shame or even, other negative feelings to sort of come to the other side and accept, hey, this is like really challenging stuff, but I'm an individual and I get to learn and I get to grow and I get to talk to people about it. The last thing I'll say for now is like, we've I think everybody on this call has had an experience of some kind of being the only person in the room who like represents your particular diaspora or community or experience. And so one of the things that makes me feel free is like being in a group where like there's so many, like we can how I've heard it put like, oh, there's like enough of us that we can disagree, like we can argue, and I don't think the four of us have been arguing, but it's like there's enough of perspective represented that we don't have, none of us has the burden of representing all Chinese diaspora. I mean, I think between us, there's like so many different regions, like immigration situations, languages, just within the four of us, and none of us had to like bear that and be like, oh, all Chinese people feel like this, or all Chinese Americans are like this. And that is like that clarity and freedom comes through um, getting to the heart of each of our own positions and like really understanding what's limiting, but also finding what's limiting helps us put that to the side and find what's liberating.
Yeah, I love that reflection. Thank you so much, Bz. Yeah, I totally vibe. Yeah, I totally resonate with what you were saying about like, yeah, like freedom is being in a space where you can disagree and having where you don't have that sense of like burden of being the representative of like an entire like diasporic group. And and I yeah, and I feel like um one of the like I feel like a lifeline for me in terms of just like trying to find my own like artistic voice or creative voice or practice or whatever, like as a teenager was actually um was discovering, or not discovering is not the right word, but like basically learning how to illegally download um like films from Asia, like films made by Japanese directors or Chinese directors or Korean directors. And because um I still sort of like struggle with identifying as Chinese American because like I don't really feel American. I mean, I have an American passport now, which allows me, yeah, which I got so I could vote. But I was, yeah, like I had a green card until I was like well in my 20s. And I remember like traveling, if I, every time I left the country, I would have to like register with the police at like I was in the UK and like when I was in college and I had to register with the police in London like every other month and so that but yeah, but just like being, like watching a film maybe like Koreeda or Wong Kar-wai where there's like there's fucked up people who are Asian and that's normal. It's like that's and uh and I think that's yeah, and that's the feeling that I get whenever I'm in Asia too. Like even though like whenever I'm in China, I'm frequently mistaken for like Malaysian Chinese or like I'm often thought of as like viewed as sort of like foreign born Chinese, even though I was born in China. And but like when I'm in Asia, like my subjectivity is not in question, right? Like like Chinese people can also be villains, and that's cool. And and having the agency to like be a baddie if you want is totally um is really quite freeing. And so yeah, like I really appreciate everything that y'all have said so far and appreciate this conversation.
We have another audience question that is sort of switching gears here more to mapping. I sort of combined a few of them together. So I'm going to put those into the chat. The questions came specifically for you, Connie, but I think you all sort of talk about mapping in like place in your art as well. So I think that it's a good discussion for all of you. So, how did the descendants you interviewed relate to their histories in these communities? What relationships do you think people have with maps? Why did you choose mapping as a vehicle to communicate? And does the way you approach a map making change based on your artistic intent? But I think like place and mapping is something that you all cover in your work.
Yeah, thank you. So yeah, I mean, there's a lot of questions in there. I'm gonna try to answer most of them, but I may wander off base. But yeah, but I guess like the first part that I would respond to, yeah. So I mean, I really think maps are one of the oldest interfaces that humans have with, a world that is not human. They're like the maps are the first interface that we have with like the so-called natural world. And they are also this interface through which like the known and the unknown worlds come together. It's um and so yeah, like it's it's a traditionally it's a two-dimensional surface that is a flattening of all these different histories of like the way the land looks. And one of the things that I feel like is really just kind of like tripped me out when I was making the How to Make a Golden State map, so the map of Asian farm worker history in California, was how like that map is actually anchored by the rivers because there's so many places that I was mapping that it was actually overwhelming to figure out how to position them. And especially since I actually really don't like working with grids. Like I am not a grid person. And so I was like, okay, how do I do this without a grid because I'm lazy and and I'm more of like a freehand kind of like artist. And so I was I was like, okay, let me start with the rivers. And I was like, oh duh, like all agricultural communities are formed along rivers, obviously. But like just physically like anchoring everything to the water was like profoundly moving for me and it actually changed my relationship to California. And while I was drawing these rivers, I was going through all these different historical maps of the rivers and like they were totally inconsistent. And then like a second light bulb went off where I was like, duh, like these rivers are constantly changing. Like of course, and so there were all these rivers that had dried up or like lakes that had dried up with it, across these different maps. And yeah, and I feel like you mentioned this too in your presentation, Evelyn, like, lakes that resurface or like disappear. And so like ghosts, yeah, like water is, I mean, I feel like Toni Morrison, there's like a famous quote from Toni Morrison where she talks about how water is always trying to return to itself. And so like it always has the memory of itself. And that yeah, that like and so water is such like an incredible vehicle for also thinking about memory. And so yeah, so like while I was working on that map, that was yeah, that and so like for each map, I kind of have like a different material anchor that I work with. And a lot of that's also one of the reasons why like most of my maps have an indexical element where, it has like a cyanotype base, for example, where like the map is physically registering the land that that I'm trying to represent. And I mean I love making maps for numerous reasons. One, because I actually have a really bad sense of direction, like atrocious. And maps are a way for me to like really like methodically and slowly orient myself to a place. And And so each map starts with a question where I'm, for example, like how would I relate to my home of California differently if I were to make a map of the Asian farm worker histories, or how would I make a map that, or like, how do I make a map that is not for me, but for the communities that I'm depicting, who are at the heart of this map? Because most of my maps are for me. And so, um, they are, even when they look, even when they have that sort of, when they use like the trope of the map of this like aerial view or whatever, like they're actually intensely personal because all the research is through, funneled through my bias and my perspective. And I started making maps when my grandfather, my maternal grandfather, my Lao died a couple years ago because he loved maps and he was actually an amateur historian. So he spent most of his life like, working um like supervising the production line at a factory in Loyang. But his dream was to be a scholar. But he couldn't do that because of the Cultural Revolution. And so he had this practice of like writing in his journal every single day. So when he died, he left behind an entire bookshelf full of handwritten journals that he bound. And every morning he would wake up at 6 with the sunrise and write down the day's events. And he also wrote, and he would like integrate that with like his memories of our family and his family home in Nanchang, which was burned down during World War II by the Japanese Imperial Army. And so it was like he was like braiding his own family history with the history of China, during, like, and he lived through a period of intense change in China where, there was like multiple regime shifts, like and so and so like recounting his history through these different, through like personal history, like public slash like state issued histories, like creating that sort of like collage of history was his way of making sense of his place in a changing China. And he also, yeah, and maps were a way for him to recognize that. And so actually, like when the first time my mom and I went back to China, um, after immigrating to the States, uh, we brought back lots of gifts, as one does for family. And most of my family members asked for like handbags and like, like luxury items, but he wanted a book of maps because he wanted to see what like an American imperialist view of the world looked like because all he had ever known were Chinese maps of the world. And, with like the USSR, but he wanted like an American map. And even when he died, like that book of maps that we brought was still at his desk because he looked at it every single day. So yeah.
It was beautiful. I have a super quick, very interesting anecdote. Like growing up in China, the map always had the Atlantic Ocean in the middle. And then it was flipped. And I was like, the first time I saw a map here, world map here, I was like, oh, of course, the US is in the center. So it's always like, mapping is very like an imperial project. Anyways, um, that was beautiful though. Thank you for sharing.
Yeah, I think that is a really maps are inherently political because you have to have a certain level of power to have a map or for people to look at your map in particular. So I think it's really interesting to think about who gets to create maps. And I think that also brings us back to the questions of who gets to dream, who gets to have knowledge and create knowledge, and all the things that you all talked about today. And I think that that's a really um, beautiful example of the power that maps have. And um, So I'm going to, unless there are any more burning questions, I'm going to cut us off there. Thank you all so much for coming. Bz, thank you for organizing all the artists, and also thank you for bringing your art to the historical collection for our exhibition at the Gibson House. Thank you all so much for coming and sharing your knowledge.